everyone, welcome to today's lesson on subtracting integers and then also looking at the distance between integers. So something we're going to talk about a ton this year is that subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. And when I talk about the opposite, I mean the term we learned recently. It's the same distance from 0, but on the other side of the number line. The opposite of 3 is negative 3. The opposite of negative 10 is positive 10 or 10. Okay, so our first question here is we're trying to do 2 minus 3. So now that we're in 7th grade, you can do 2 minus 3. So unfortunately, your teachers in the past might have told you, you can't do 2 minus 3. Well, that's not true. You can. You just don't get a positive number. You can't think about it with money, because people can be in debt. Okay, so we're going to look at this question, 2 minus 3, a few different ways. So the first thing that we're going to do is I want us to actually rewrite this as the equivalent addition problem. So I have positive 2 here, and then I'm subtracting a positive 3. So now I have to go to this concept. Subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. Okay, so I'm trying to turn this into an addition problem. I'm going to change my subtraction sign into addition. And then I have to ask myself, what is the opposite of positive 3? Well, what is the opposite of positive 3? Negative 3, exactly. So 2 minus 3 is the same thing as 2 plus negative 3. All right, so let's first just thinking about what 2 minus 3 would mean in our dirt model. So if we have a positive number, that represents dirt, right? So if we have 2, that's like a pile of dirt that we'd say is 2 units high. And then 3, positive 3, is also going to be like a pile of dirt that's 3 units high, or 3 units of dirt. Okay, so I have 2 units of dirt minus 3 units of dirt. What do I end up with? Well, subtracting, we're going to think of that as taking away, right? Getting rid of, taking away. So here I have a pile that's 2 units of dirt, and then I need to take away 3 units of dirt. So let's see what happens when I do that. Okay, so I'm going to take away 1 unit of dirt. Then I'm going to take away a 2nd unit of dirt. And now I need to take away my 3rd unit of dirt. Pretty fun. I end up with a hole in the ground that is negative 1 deep. So that is going to be my answer to this question, which we'll see in lots of different forms. But 2 minus 3 is going to be equal to negative 1. Now let's talk about why that's the same as 2 plus negative 3. So let's talk about my components here. So when I have 2 plus negative 3, that's again going to be a pile of dirt that's 2 units high. And then negative 3 is going to be a hole in the ground that's 3 units deep. So it goes down here to negative 3. So when I have addition, that means I'm combining the two things. Okay, so I'm starting with 2, so I'll start there. And I'm going to move my negative 3, my hole in the ground, to be on top of my dirt that's too high. And then when I do that, what do I end up with? Well, now I don't have any dirt above the ground, and I just have a hole in the ground that again is 1 unit deep, meaning that the solution is going to be that this is also equal to negative 1. So that's kind of one visual way of thinking about how it's the same. If you're taking away positive dirt, that's the same thing as adding a hole that represents negative dirt. Okay, so now let's just take a second thinking about our absolute value method if we weren't using a number line. So what we said yesterday is that when we're adding two numbers, one positive and one negative, find the absolute values of the numbers and then you subtract them. So we're going to ask ourselves, what is the absolute value of 2? The absolute value of 2 is 2. Okay, and then what's the absolute value of negative 3? That's just 3. So then we're going to subtract the absolute values. So we'll do 3 minus 2. 3 minus 2 is equal to 1. So then we can get our answer to our addition problem, which is also a subtraction problem here. It's going to be either 1 or negative 1. So does 2 or negative 3, which one has a greater absolute value? Negative 3 does, right? Because that's 3 and 3 is bigger than 2. So that means that that sign is the one that's going to matter. That means our answer has to be a negative 1 then. Thinking about that on our number line, I have a positive 2. It's going up to positive 2. I'm adding a negative 3. So negative 3 is going to go 3 down from 2. This part is kind of like canceling out to 0 because we're subtracting away that difference. And we're just left with that arrow that goes down negative 1. Great, awesome. All right, now let's take a look at example 2. We have negative 1 minus 2. So in this case, we have a negative number, and then we're subtracting a positive number. We're subtracting positive 2. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to rewrite our subtraction problem as the equivalent addition problem. So subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. So I'm going to keep the first number, that doesn't change. And now I need to change my subtraction into addition by adding the opposite. So I'm going to switch that subtraction sign into an addition sign. And then in order to do that and be doing the same thing, I have to take the opposite of 2. So what is the opposite of 2? Perfect, perfect. The opposite of 2 is negative 2. So negative 1 minus 2 is the same thing as negative 1 plus negative 2. And we're going to justify that through the dirt model in the process of getting our correct answer. Okay, so if I look first at this, negative 1 minus 2, what does that mean? Well, that means that I have a hole in the ground that's 1 unit deep. That's the negative 1. And then I need to subtract positive 2. So in my picture, positive 2 means dirt, right? It's like a pile of dirt that's 2 units high. Subtraction means to get rid of or to take away. So in my picture, I'm going to grab 2 units of dirt and take it away. And when I do that, what do I end up with? A hole in the ground that is now 3 units deep. This whole thing is now negative 3. Let me just confirm we understand that what I did is I took away 2 units of dirt. So I can line that up, and that is exactly 2 units of dirt. So one more time. I had my hole in the ground that was just negative 1 deep, and then I removed or subtracted away 2 units of dirt, and I ended up with a hole in the ground that was negative 3. Okay, so that is the answer. That is my difference. Negative 1 minus 2, that's going to be equal to negative 3. So now let's see why that's the same as negative 1 plus negative 2. So what would negative 1 plus negative 2 be in our model? That's going to be a hole in the ground that's 1 unit deep, and then another hole in the ground which is 2 units deep. And when you add holes together, right, I'm going to combine them. So I start with my hole that's negative 1 deep and combine it with the one that I currently have. And when I combine those holes together, again, I get now a hole in the ground that is 3 units deep because I'm adding 2 different negative numbers, 2 numbers that are representing holes in the ground. So that means that here, adding a hole, right, that's the same as subtracting dirt. Adding a negative number is the same thing as subtracting a positive number. How do you create a hole? You dig dirt out of the ground. You go in the ground, grab dirt, and pull it out. Right, so that's where you're subtracting away positive dirt, and when you're doing that, you're creating a hole, which is our negative number. Like we already found, right, the answer is going to be negative 3, either way. Using our absolute value method from yesterday, what we said is you took the absolute value of both of the numbers, add them together, and then you keep the sign that we have here. But we would take the absolute value of negative 1, which is 1, the absolute value of negative 2, which is 2, add them together, 1 plus 2 is 3. But then since these were both negative, that means that negative 1 plus negative 2 is going to be equal to negative 3. All right, awesome. Let's look at another example. So for example 3, we have negative 2 minus negative 1. Often you're going to see parentheses around a negative number when you're subtracting, but it doesn't mean anything different than like negative 2 minus negative 1. So step number 1 is we're going to rewrite the subtraction problem as the equivalent addition problem. So I'm going to keep negative 2, and now I want to rewrite that subtraction sign as addition. So what is the opposite of negative 1? Positive 1. So that means that subtracting a negative number is the same thing as adding a positive number. So those are equivalent, again, because subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. So here we switched our subtraction to addition, and then we had to go from the opposite of negative 1 to positive 1. So now we're going to try to represent on my number line first negative 2 minus a negative 1. Okay, so this is a hole in the ground. It's negative 2 deep, so of course 2 deep, so of course that's negative 2. And then we want to subtract negative 1. That means we're getting rid of a hole that's 1 deep. I have my hole, and now I want to get rid of or remove that hole that's 1 deep. So let me just pick up my hole and get rid of it. And once I did that, what do I end up with? Now I end up with a hole that's 1 deep. Again, what did I do? I had this hole that was 2 deep, 2 units deep. This is a hole that's 1 unit deep, and I'm going to remove that from my picture, and I end up with a hole that's then just 1 unit deep instead of 2 units deep. That's going to be the same as having my hole, negative 2, that's 2 units deep, and adding that with a pile of dirt that's 1 unit high. right? So this is my pile of dirt. It's 1 unit high. And when I combine them, I'm going to pick up my dirt, combine it with my hole in the ground, and what happens when I do that? Again, I end up at -1. That should kind of conceptually make sense with the dirt concept, because if I think about what does it mean to get rid of a hole in the ground, if I have a hole in the ground outside, right, and now I want to get rid of my hole, there's only one way to get rid of a hole. It's to fill it in. That's how you fill it in. So that's what adding 1 is. The way to subtract or remove or get rid of a hole, a negative number, is the same as adding a positive number, filling in the hole with dirt, with positive dirt. So now if I want to represent that on my number line, right, I have -2 going down to -2, and then I have a +1. I'm going up 1, and that makes me end up at -1. Lastly, we're just going to look at one example of finding distance between two numbers, which is also going to involve subtraction. So looking at our fourth example, the lowest temperature in Philadelphia during December in all of recent history was -7 degrees Fahrenheit, and the highest temperature in December was 73 degrees. What is the difference in the highest temperature and the lowest temperature of December in Philadelphia? So what is the difference between that 73 degrees and -7 degrees? There's an absolute value rule that is an important standard in 7th grade, which is to find distance. What you can always do is you can take the absolute value of the difference of two numbers. There's two ways to do that. The order doesn't matter, which is pretty cool. So here I can take 73, and then I'm going to subtract -7, or I can subtract them in the other order, -7 minus 73, and then once I take the absolute value of the insides, that's going to give me my answer. So when I have 73 here minus -7, I want to change subtraction into addition, but I can only do that if I then take the opposite of -7, because subtracting is the same as adding the opposite. So what's the opposite of -7? Right, +7. So with this model, then I have 73 plus 7. 73 plus 7 is what? 80. So what's the absolute value of 80? That is just 80. Okay, so the difference here is going to be 80 degrees. And then I could do that my other way as well. Okay, so either way, using that absolute value rule, subtracting the difference and then taking the absolute value, that's going to give us our distance. However, something I do, and I want to show us on the number line as well, because I think conceptually I don't really do either of those in my head. What I do is I think about, okay, what's both of their differences from 0? And then let me add that up, which is basically what we're doing in this version of it. I want to figure out how far is this distance from -7 to 73. How do I get there? Well, first let's figure out from 0 to 73. What's that distance? That's going to be 73. Okay, and then here, what's the distance between 0 and -7? How far away is -7 from 0? 7. Okay, so to find my total distance, I would just add this distance, 73, plus this distance, 7. And that's what I did here, and you get 80. So the distance between the two is 80. All right, great. Good job, everyone.